Hello, my name is Rick Houston, and welcome to the Scene Vault Podcast, your source for all things NASCAR history. Presented by QWare. Maintain excellence.
The day NASCAR and all of us associated in any way with NASCAR forget its past, that's the day we don't have any future.
Mike, you were born and raised in Bristol, Virginia. How aware of the racetrack up there were you while you were growing up?
Yeah, you don't grow up in a town like Bristol and there be a NASCAR track there and not know about the track and not know about NASCAR. So it was a heavy influence on everybody that lived in Bristol, but certainly myself.
Okay. Now, did you actually work there at one point?
Part-time, just like on race weekends.
Okay.
Yeah.
What were you doing?
Everything. I mean, in those days, you kind of cleaned up from the last race 2 weeks before the next race and painted walls and got things ready to go. And so I piddled around down there helping them get opening up just because I really just enjoyed the sport so much. And when the big show came to town, you wanted to be part of the big show.
Now, is that a deal where you were actually working towards maybe one day working in the sport full time, or was that just something to do for a kid from Bristol?
It was just the enthusiasm around the NASCAR race coming to Bristol. And that's really all it was. There was no agenda there. It was just wanting to be part of that big weekend there.
Okay. All right. You, after college, you found work as an accountant. And was that something that you enjoyed, or did you have this sense that maybe there was something else out there for you?
No, I did that because math was easy for me.
So you're the one.
I could add 1 and 1 and get 2 pretty easily. So I took the easy route.
Okay.
Well, you also refereed football and basketball. At what ages? What age groups?
So it was in I did a little bit of everything from the Saturday morning Pee Wee leagues up to the NCAA women's districts in both Virginia and Tennessee, the VHSL and the TSAA.
Well, I didn't know that. Well, do you have a good story about your time as a referee?
I've got a few of them, but I better keep them to myself. The one quick one was I was doing it wasn't a season game. It was a kind of a preseason game between Old Dominion and Virginia Tech girls. And I just, I'm not a little guy, but I was the umpire, so I was throwing the ball up, and I couldn't get the ball up high enough for them 2 gals that were jumping for Old Dominion and Virginia Tech, and it was really embarrassing. The coach from Virginia Tech came over and asked if I needed help. It was a little humbling.
Wow. Old Dominion is my alma mater, by the way.
Know that.
How much of an experience as a referee did you fall back on when it came to dealing with competitors in the garage?
I think that same structure exists in all sports. So the officiating or the balancing of 2 players or 2 teams or the competition of sports is kind of inherent in every sport. So while I didn't specifically consciously draw awareness from that era in my life, I think it certainly helped me to comprehend the balancing of rules and regulations across the NASCAR garages.
Mike, how did you land at WOPI AM, the radio station? Were you actually on the air?
I was only on the air as a substitute in the middle of the night, maybe twice. and I did a couple of sports events where it was like a John Battle and a Patrick Henry high school baseball game and nobody else was covering, and we kind of put them all together. But everything along the way has just been kind of dumb luck for me, and the OPI stint was one of those moments that I really enjoyed. But I had no master plan to stay in radio or be in radio, but it was a good stop along the way.
So you didn't have a Wolfman Jack persona or anything like that? Where
I've got a radio face. I just don't have a radio voice.
Now, being the sports director, that naturally meant that you were going to cover races at Bristol. Was that your first professional foray into the sport?
It could have been more directly, working around the grounds at Bristol, I think, came first.
Okay.
But through the radio station, the ability to become part of the media of the sport, and while not a primary one, but certainly becoming part of that, kind of woke me up to the depth of what a professional sports is. I'm still one of the biggest fans of this sport there is, but I think up until that point I was all fan. And then I became interested and a fan of the business of the sport, because when you look behind the curtain and you see all the elements that it takes to drive the sport, either in that era or today, I think it's really interesting. And there's as many great characters behind the curtain than there is in front of the TV cameras. I mean, I just think this sport is made up of a genuinely great group of characters.
Working in the sport, NASCAR, working in the sport, had that been a conscious goal of yours?
No. I just at a Bristol weekend, we were sitting around and Ed Clark was in Bristol. Eddie Gossage would bounce between Bristol and Nashville, and we were the trio of that generation that did a lot of things together. And Tom Roberts, if you'll remember, TRPR, he was the media guy, the PR guy at Atlanta Raceway, and he was from Nashville. So he and Eddie knew each other from the Nashville, Tennessee days, and Eddie told me that Tom was going to leave and go back to Nashville and do something different, and that there was a spot open in Atlanta, and the guy that run Atlanta happened to be coming to the race that weekend. And so introductions were made. I sat down with Walt Nix for a few minutes, and next thing I knew, I was packing all my stuff going to Atlanta.
So that's how that job came about, huh?
I kind of backed in. That's what I say. I've been very fortunate with all the moments that time has presented me an opportunity.
Well, all of us have had mentors in the sport, people we looked up to. Who were some of the people you leaned on in those earliest days in the garage area and even Atlanta and beyond?
Yeah. I think from working on the racetrack side of it, being in the promoting business and operating business, I think the relationship I had with a guy like Ed Clark helped a lot. But when I got to Atlanta Raceway, there were some really interesting characters in Atlanta in that area. Jack Keane and Alf Knight, Ernie Moore. And Ernie was a full-time baker at Nabisco in Atlanta, but he was also a weekend official for NASCAR. But when the races came to Atlanta, he would step away from being on the NASCAR side and would help Alf Knight in the racetrack get ready for the races. And so I had the benefit of a lot of years of experience from kind of both ends of it, from Ed's perspective, but from Alf Knight and Ernie Moore, and then those guys were running races before there was a NASCAR.
Mike, in 1985, you became the general manager at Atlanta, and you've been in some sort of management role ever since. How much of an adjustment was there for you when it came to dealing with people in a management role?
Again, I think it was not part of a master plan, but it progressed in a way and at a pace that gave me a lot of opportunity to learn and to really understand the sport and the making of it. And in those days, we were building the sport, and there was a institutional group, if there was, from it might have been from in my case, working in Atlanta, LG DeWitt owned Rockingham, and I had the benefit of learning from the Rockingham staff when I'd go help Rockingham. But you guys will remember the days of the NMPA conventions where all the tracks would get together and we'd share thoughts and ideas about stuff. And those were really, I look back at that era, and I think that era was really the building blocks in a lot of ways that, as time goes by, most of us in that generation will be forgotten and go on down the road. But the things that we did back then, I think, are very substantial to the foundation of the sport as we see it today and in the future. So I picked up a lot from a lot of people, and kind of like a sponge. And I learned a lot from people that I said, this person has got it right. And I want to do it like they did. And I also learned a lot from people who says, this guy doesn't have a clue. And so I don't want to be like that. So I learned from both ends of the stick.
Mike, you went to Talladega as GM, then you went to ISC as the vice president, then you went back to Talladega as the president, and this is all in the late 1980s. Were those particular goals that you had set out for yourself, or were you basically just along for the ride on the fast track at that point?
So the one conscious decision that I made in my career was to hook my wagon somewhere.
Yeah.
And in that era, if you all remember, most racetracks were very independent. There wasn't the groupings of Speedway Motorsports and the NASCAR tracks like it is today. So Rockingham had its own personality. Richmond had its own personality. North Wilkesboro was Enoch Staley and Clay Earls in Martinsville. So every track had its own personality, much like the race teams did. And I was sitting there watching the sport grow, and Atlanta was very similar to that. Walt Nix and LG DeWitt owned Atlanta, and everybody out there that had racetracks and was running races on the NASCAR schedule and building the NASCAR programs, they did something different. And then they raced when it came time to race at the racetracks. They put the races together. So I was looking around in the industry, and the one group that made a living out of this sport from daylight to dusk and all through the night was the France family. Between Daytona and Talladega at the time, the NASCAR part of it, their family made their living depended on the success of the sport. It wasn't a second opportunity. It wasn't a hobby. It wasn't anything but purely it had to survive. And so when I had the opportunity to join the ISC and the France family ranks at that point, that's the one conscious decision that I made. I could have stayed at Atlanta and been happy. I could have stayed in Talladega the rest of my career and been absolutely happy. But I think that one decision I made was what really worked out well for me.
The higher up you rose, there were fewer people that you could go to for advice because they hadn't experienced the kinds of things that you were experiencing. And you've mentioned the France family. Was there anybody that you felt like you could count on as that go-to person for that kind of mentorship as you continued to rise up the ladder?
Well, there was always Bill Jr.
Yeah.
For a long part of my career, Bill Jr. was a person that I worked for, but I could also get incredible advice from. He and Jim France are just incredibly street smart as well as business smart. And Bill Jr. had that big personality that made me understand that our sport was a relationship sport. And from the regulatory side, yes, you have to be the decision maker or the enforcer of the regulations. But remember, even when you're having to do that personality you're dealing with is a big part of our sport. And I learned a lot of that from Bill Jr. And Jim France has always been around as a shoulder to stand on. And but Jim Hunter was a lot of help to me even before I came, when I was in Atlanta and he was in Talladega. And guys like Jim Hunter, Les Richter, there were a lot of characters in that era that I was able to say, man, John Cooper was another guy I could call up. But I think my instant go-to guy was Bill Jr. along the line.
1994, you joined NASCAR as vice president of competition. How big of an adjustment was it to go from managing a racetrack or a group of racetracks at ISC to managing an entire garage full of type A personalities who all had their own particular interests at heart?
So I thought that after a dozen years of running racetracks and knowing all these people and seeing them 2 or 3 times a year and you know, I thought I was pretty well experienced in the sport. I had no clue the difference between coming from a racetrack and standing in the middle of the sanctioning body. I had no clue the difference. I mean, I'm looking around saying, what in the world have I got myself into? But my safety nets and my life preservers and my life rafts were people like Bill Jr. And then very quickly along the way, though, there were people in the garage area that I could navigate with, and those characters were very important too. A Bud Moore, a Dale Sr. as our relationship developed, but certainly before that, Richard Childress, Richard Petty. I think what a lot of people will never be able to get their hands around is how much experience Richard Petty can pass on to any level in this sport, particularly in that era. And Richard Petty was a wealth of help when something would go down, and I'd get his input from it. And you guys knew Bud Moore. Bud Moore, if you didn't ask his opinion, he was going to call you up and give it to you. So. But when I left the racetracks and came to the sanctioning body, I thought, man alive, I thought I knew this sport. I'd been a fan of it for my whole life almost, and had done all this work at places like Atlanta and Talladega and Bristol. I didn't have a clue. I mean, it was a whole different world coming into the sanctioning body.
How did you manage dealing with the technical side of the sport? Because I know you had issues you had to deal with.
You relied on people that knew the technical side of the sport. Before I joined NASCAR had brought Gary Nelson in, which was kind of like bringing the fox from, to guard the hen house. But it incredibly smart technical operator. And so from my perspective, I knew a little bit, just enough to be dangerous about all this stuff. But I relied very heavily on the people. And we had a lot of smart people then. We've got a lot more and a lot more smarter people today. But you rely on the technical experts in the sport. But that goes back, though, to some of the relationships in the garage area that you get the sanctioning body side of it from smart people in the sanctioning body. But then you could go to a Richard Childress and a Bud Moore, a Larry McClure, and different folks and say, well, what do you think? And sometimes you maybe lay too many cards on the table, and so you learn from that. And then sometimes you got enough opinions to where you knew, say, well, crap, not everybody's going to be happy with this decision, so we might as well just draw a line somewhere and go after it.
You said you worked very closely with Bill France Jr. Who was Bill France Jr. behind closed doors?
Same thing he was in front.
Hmm.
He was what you saw in the public was the same person. He was very street smart. He had a great personality. And when I say it was a great personality, it was a personality that you could learn from if you would pay attention. And then he also had that educator part of him that he'd kick in and almost make you pay attention so that you would get what he was trying to tell you. And the other thing I learned from Bill Jr. is the people that he would surround himself with. And his brother Jim and the world's beginning to see that now, but he's always been an incredible resource for this industry. But along the way, guys like Paul Cameron, that used to be a head of Purolator was close to Bill, and I got to hang out with Paul Cameron along the line, who was just a remarkable individual. But Bill would surround himself with people outside of the garage area that he could learn from, but he was really, really good at passing that on and getting everybody together to see the bigger picture.
Mike, you mentioned some of the relationships that you developed over the years in the garage. Did you find yourself having to maintain some kind of professional distance with people because everybody wanted something in the garage, and Ford guys wanted something for Ford, the Chevy guys wanted something for Chevy, the team guys had their own interests at heart. So did you have to maintain that kind of sense of distance with people at times?
Yeah, I don't know that I'd use the word distance, but I think what I did learn, and it took a while, was that there was a very distinct line of separation.
Yeah.
That as I mentioned earlier, the NASCAR is strengths. One of its great strengths is its relationships with the stakeholders, whether it's the media or the teams or the drivers or the sponsors, the broadcast partners, the racetracks, whoever it is. I think one of our greatest strengths is the relationships we have with the stakeholders in the sport. But there it does have to be sometimes the line between that relationship and making a decision on what's right for the sport. Whether it's a rule, whether it's an occurrence in the middle of the race, or whether it's a decision that you make about a schedule or a date, or all of those different things that the sanctioning body has to make a decision on. That's a line of separation. That's not I wouldn't call it distancing as much as I'd call but you had to learn that. And that's, I'm oversimplifying it by saying the way I'm saying it, but that's one of the things that I think that took me a while to get my head around. And there again, I go back to Bill and Jim France, who from their early beginnings, their entire lives, they saw how Bill Sr. and Andy B did it and people that they had around them. And so they were passing that on to me. It just took me a while to figure it out.
You had been a part of the media at OPI, and then you had dealt with the media when you worked on the track side of the business, but nothing like what you experienced when you moved over to competition. How comfortable were you in front of the media?
I think for the most part, I was comfortable. I learned to be wary though. Because
why?
Well, when you were speaking for a racetrack, you were generally promoting the track. It was a host facility at some point in that conversation. And when you got on the sanctioning body side and you started talking to the media, then you were part of City Hall. And so whatever come out, it was coming out as a face and a talking head for City Hall, and that's different. But it's just something that I had to learn and get my head wrapped around and understand how to do it. But there were tough moments, but for the most part, there goes back to my era in the sport, our reliance on the media to take what the sport was doing and pass it on to the fans was, and still is, as critical as anything else we've got in the stakeholder world. So I've always had great respect for the media, but there's a big difference from promoting a race at a racetrack and explaining a decision on the sanctioning body side. I would tell you that.
Well, that is a perfect lead into my next question, because with every decision that you made or that was made by NASCAR, somebody was going to get mad about it, whether it be a competitor, whether it be the media, whether it be the fans. And there were just so many voices and this is even before social media. Was there ever a point where you just wanted to say, everybody, just shut up? That was our decision. Deal with it. That's the way it's going to be. And you don't know as much as you think you know. How were you able to be in that position and still maintain your sanity?
Yeah, I'd always looked at it as my job, and it was just it's what I was given the responsibility to do. So when it come to moments like that, and we had a couple of them, you remember the one in Michigan where everybody didn't like the new car, which was called Car of Tomorrow, and we called them all in, and I wouldn't even let them talk. I just said, listen to me.
Yeah.
And, you know, we're not going to go build another car in the middle of the season. This is what we got type thing. And, you know, it comes with some pushback and it comes with some angst to it. But there are times when the sanctioning body just simply has to say, right, wrong, or indifferent, this is what we're doing. So let's go do it. And in fairness to our sport, once you draw the line in the sand, particularly to the teams in the garage area and the car owners and the drivers, once you say, here's what we're doing, they say, okay, and then they go do it. But there's a lot of dialogue leading up to that moment where you kind of say, this is it.
Mike, you were eventually named president of NASCAR, and almost immediately you are caught up in one of the worst crises the sport has ever known, when we lost Adam and Kenny and Tony and Dale and then Blaze, all within a year and a half. Professionally, the stakes were obvious, but personally, I'm not asking about specifics. I'm not asking about all the controversy or whatever, but personally, how difficult was it for you to go through all that? Because it's seemed tough. Like you were the center of the hurricane.
It's being the center of the hurricane wasn't as challenging or as difficult as it was knowing each of these individuals and their families, and having to have dialogue with their families on what happened, and then obviously the Dale Earnhardt piece was global. But I look back at all of that and just knocking on a piece of wood because we've had a pretty good run lately. But you know, I don't know. I'm sure there were nights when I lay down and I couldn't sleep, and it was overwhelming. But most of that came from the anxiety of having to talk to the family members about what just happened. And then having to deal with the global aspect of Dale Sr.
Well, as you mentioned, we've had a good run going when it comes to things like that. But that has to be attributed somewhat to the many safety advancements that have been made since 2001. And I think, to you personally, that's got to be feeling pretty good, I think.
Well, you always, that's why I always knock on a piece of wood after I say that, because, or I even let it go through my head, because this is a dangerous sport. And that's part of the attraction of it, is the remarkableness of what drivers do, like yesterday's race in Talladega. I mean, that's still mind-boggling to me. And I've been deep into this sport for 40 years, and I just, it's still a dangerous sport, and it's still as entertaining as I'll get out. But what we had the opportunity to do between 99 and 2001 is amass a effort from everywhere. Everyone wanted to be part of this effort to make racing safer, and it's worked. I think, but that effort has not stopped, because you get it from 85% down to 99%. That 1% still there. And so you have to keep working on it, and you have to be diligent about it. And I'm proud of NASCAR's diligence about it as a company and as a sanctioning body, but I'm equally proud of all of the components from outside of our sport that help in that cause, and all the different, just the different levels of effort. And then as technology and materials and the advancements that we've seen over the last 20 years of the ability to do things, you have to keep applying that newness to that effort. And I think NASCAR does that really well. And when I say NASCAR, the company of NASCAR does it because they want to do that and get that right. But the umbrella of NASCAR, the industry, the garage area, the team owners, everybody wants to get that right. And I think we've seen evidence of that. But I remind everybody, it's still a dangerous sport.
Looking back on your time at the helm, what decision would you maybe look at and maybe go back and do something differently? Which one would you like to have back?
Yeah, that's a tough question to answer, because I've got them in my head. It's a small number, less than a handful. But I'd be afraid to divulge them, because I think for the most part we did pretty good on things. I think NASCAR is always very thorough and diligent. But in the era that I was at the helm of it, there's probably 2 or 3 that stand out very quickly to me, but I'd be afraid to divulge them.
Hey, it's just between you,
Maybe not afraid
you, me,
to. Maybe I just
Steve, and
don't
a
want
few
to.
thousand listeners. It's just between me, you, Steve, and a few thousand listeners. You'll be fine.
Well, see, let's go back to your question about the media.
Yeah.
I love y'all to death, but I still have to be wary.
I understand. Mike, you've been busy in this sport for decades. You've been at the helm and directed the sport and its competitors, and you've earned a lot of respect in the garage area and with the media. Put you on the spot here. What do you think your legacy is going to be?
I don't know if there is one. See, I think my best contribution to this sport is that it goes on like it is, and it's seamless, and people can look around, and if I'm at the racetrack, I get to say hello to them and hang out with them. If I'm not there, everything works fine. So personally, my legacy is that I'm not missed, because if that's the case and I did everything right, where those passed on the legacy of this sport to me and put me in custody of parts of it, I wanted to do the same thing. I wanted to be sure that what I do is pass on components that may not even be relevant today, but the history of our sport, I think, is the history of our sport and should always be considered and thought of. So I think my hope, and it's I can already see it. So it's my legacy is that I'm not missed, that this sport is as good and strong as it's ever been, with or without me. Rick, I got the email with all those back issues and everything.
Yes.
I spent 4 hours last night after the race. I spent 4 hours going back and reading some of those, and I just cracked up, because some of them, that's just a sign of the time right there, particularly the early issues when they were telling all the little stories that might have happened around the racetrack. And I really enjoyed that. I haven't got through them all yet, but I would encourage race fans, but I would also encourage people that work in this sport today to take time and go back and look at things like that, because that's our history book. That tells how we got here. And some of those, I remember a lot of the characters that nobody will even recognize the names of except for us, and think, gosh, I remember when this happened. I remember when this guy did that.
Yeah.
I remember when all this. And I remember when LG had to get Ned Jarrett out of trouble in Atlanta. And it was just all these great moments that were written up in the Grand National scene. So thanks for sharing that with me.